Good afternoon. Welcome to our second meeting. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Melissa Labonte, who's from Fordham University, who's done a great deal of work on the role of the UN and the General Assembly in the global financial crisis, and so she's here with some remarks. She'll talk for about half an hour and then take some questions. So, without any further ado, Dr. Labonte, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. This is really, really a treat. It's a treat just to sort of get out of the Bronx. It's a treat to, come down and see your campus, and also to resurrect what I'd been doing for about 6 months into the form of a talk, which is going to be complemented by a number of written publications, hopefully, as well, in that I was invited to participate as sort of an academic embed within the General Assembly's office from about January to July of 2009. But the discussions about the work that I'd be doing started back in October and November of 2008, which was a very precipitous moment for the General Assembly and for the UN in general, because it was sort of wrestling with the idea of what to do about the global financial crisis, which was just at that time beginning to unfold. And so the path that was taken by the UN and the General Assembly in particular is one that I sort of got to see firsthand, and at the same time, now that I've had some time to think about it and reflect on it and talk to some people after the fact as well, now that much of the dust is sort of settling around some of the bigger issues that the GA is taking up with this issue, with this particular event in world politics. Some of my initial insights remarkably have shifted, and they've I don't know if you can say that they've matured, but certainly I'm thinking about the way in which the UN crafted its response to the global financial and economic crisis a little differently now than I was when I was sort of in the thick of it while it was all happening. Which I guess is a lesson in life, not to write things too soon, right, after you've been experiencing them. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that, I should say, not necessarily the work that I did, but sort of what I was observing, and the way in which the UN was responding to this crisis, the GA in particular, the General Assembly in particular. And then I want to use as just a framing device different components that my research has led me to conclude are important in thinking about global economic governance more generally. And throughout the presentation, I'll be sort of weaving in where the UN and the General Assembly have sort of touched upon some of these mechanisms of global economic governance. Because if we're interested in finding some answers or explanations for where the UN system and the General Assembly in particular is headed in terms of its role in global economic governance, it's important to see where they've tracked in terms of these measures, in terms of these concepts. And so in thinking about global economic governance, the first thing that usually comes to mind is that it should be inclusive. It should in some way strike a balance between government, market, and civil society actors, among others. Another dimension is legitimacy, or is economic governance legitimate? This has been a really big issue that the UN system has tried to tackle. And it's not a new issue. The legitimacy question in terms of global arrangements and governance mechanisms is one that goes way back, to certainly the discussions about the new international economic order, for example, in the 1970s. So whose voices matter is a question that is a perennial question at the UN in terms of all issues related to governance, but especially in 2008 and 2009 with global economic governance. A third dimension of global economic governance is effectiveness. Strikingly, what I've found is that there's a paucity here in terms of the UN's role in global economic governance, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But solutions need to be workable, they need to be cost effective, particularly in an economic crisis, right? In a climate of crisis where resources are scarce and nations are risk averse. So the solutions that you come up with, whether they be solutions to mitigate the impact of a crisis or solutions about longer term reform, have to be sellable, and they have to be perceived to be effective by other nations if in fact they're going to have a long lifespan and become real and more than just rhetoric. A fourth dimension is equity and the equitable arrangements that we see as undergirding the structures of global economic governance, the ethics of reform, social justice issues, These are, again, very prominent issues that were debated during 2008 and 2009 by the UN. And lastly, sustainability. This is another dimension that I think has become actually, sadly, less prominent in the debate that we're seeing now. It was front and center in the debate in 2009, and it's sort of gotten lost, and I'm not quite sure why, which is an interesting question for me to follow up on. But the sustainability dimension, the people-centered aspect of sustainability, is one that has continued to inform the debate taking place at the UN on its role in governance of the global financial architecture, particularly as it relates to development. But the environment-centered piece is gone. The idea of a green recovery, something I don't find many nations talking about anymore, which is really interesting. So this is sort of my framing device for the talk today, and it's not meant to be overly analytical, but it's meant to sort of keep anchoring us back to these points. Okay. The impact of the global and financial economic crisis, just to really quickly review. Some of you have probably read the statistics, you've seen the reports, you've heard it from your peers and colleagues and your professors. I want to talk about just two dimensions in general: debt servicing, external financing gaps, and then on the other side, the more development indicators like poverty, unemployment, and hunger. If we look at the sort of macroeconomic, microeconomic side, what is being reported now by the IMF, for example, in its recent debt sustainability assessment, is that 40% of countries are at high risk of debt distress, but at the same time, they're 30% at low risk. And the IMF indeed has come out and said that they don't see any globally systemic risks, on the horizon for countries in terms of debt, which gives us really sort of an insight into the variability of the impact of the crisis on varying nations. And this is something you'll see across the board, that the impact of the crisis was not uniform, say, in the developing world. Some developing world countries fared much better than others, and it's the same in the developed world. Not all of the developed world countries got hit the way, say, the U.S. did, which the U.S. doesn't like to necessarily lose sight of in intergovernmental negotiations. They're quite forward about telling everybody how hard they've had it, which doesn't ring very true with the developing world. At the end of 2008, total developing country external debt was about 3.7 trillion, which was a significant increase over that same external debt level in 2007. Debt levels of 30 nations exceeded 60% of their gross domestic product in 2009 and 2010. And the extreme cases seem to come from the Caribbean region, where, for example, Jamaica, that debt level of 60% of GDP is actually, that debt level for Jamaica is 128% of GDP, and for St. Kitts and Nevis, it's 178%. So again, it reinforces that notion of variability of impact. External debt to GDP ratios of developing countries increased from just under 44% to 52% between 2008 and 2009. And the external financing gap for developing countries was about $350 billion in 2009. It was projected to be slightly lower in 2010, $315 billion, but still a significant gap that developing countries fear is going to put them at risk of missing, for example, a number of the Millennium Development Goal benchmarks, as well as just being able to service debt and to begin to think about social spending again, which is something that many developing countries have said they've had to cut in the face of having to service, this sort of ballooning debt, and debt that isn't necessarily getting, alleviated through programs like the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the HIPC initiative. On the other side, we have, data about the impact of the crisis on things like poverty, employment, and hunger. The global financial and economic crisis has pushed, according to the World Bank, more than 64 million people into poverty. Most of them are in the developing world. 31 million in least developed countries, which is a very special category of the developing world, have lost jobs or cannot find full-time employment, according to the International Labor Organization. And over 100 million individuals have now been added to the global total of the world's hungry, which is now topping more than 1 billion. There's always a discussion about where are we in the crisis? Are we in the middle? Are we at the beginning? Is this a tidal wave? Are we coming out of it? And it's hard to know. It's still hard to know, even from these statistics, sort of where we are and whether this is a long-term crisis that is going to, you know, its net effects are going to be felt much later, and we'll be able to look back and realize just what the scope of it was. Whereas, you know, there are others that say, no, we're definitely at the tail end. We're about to come out of this. But these statistics still show that there's you know, stress on the international system as a result of the impact of the crisis, but that the impact is not being felt the same way in all countries. Okay. Turning now to taking sort of a trip down memory lane for me. In late 2008, as this crisis was unfolding, there was a great deal of talk within the UN system about whether this was a Bretton Woods moment. Was it a Bretton Woods moment? What would you, I mean, no one had well, I should say, the answers were largely optimistic back in 2008, that yes, this was a Bretton Woods moment. This was a moment for change. And now, in 2010, I don't know if we'd answered the question in the same way. And there's you know, there's a puzzle in there, because if there was a moment of change and it really existed, what happened to it? Why wasn't it, you know, fully, I don't want to say exploited, but why wasn't it fully utilized so that change could actually take place? And if we're not in a moment of change anymore, why? Is it just because the crisis is largely abating, or are there other reasons that we need to look at to sort of explore that question? Now, I think in large part there was also a hope among certain members within the UN that this was not just a Bretton Woods moment, but a moment to sort of return to the dialogue of the 1970s and reassert a role for the developing world in the creation of a new system of global economic governance through the retooling or reforming of the global financial architecture. Most notably, the targeted institutions, it won't surprise you, would be the international financial institutions, right? The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, to some degree the World Trade Organization, and even mechanisms within the UN system and other independent institutions like the Basel Committee on Banking Standards, or the Bank of International Settlements, the G20, which I know you've heard about in your last lecture. So there was sort of, you know, again, a consensus among some members within the UN that this was a very important moment, and it was a moment for, you know, where real change could actually occur. So this, I don't want to call it a euphoria, but there was certainly a higher level of optimism among member states, several in particular, that led to a new way of thinking among the leadership within the General Assembly to reassert its role. This was a moment when we can get in on the game, and we can actually get a new seat at the table. And through the president of the General Assembly, and I'll keep referring to him as the PGA. The PGA, it doesn't mean golf. It's, you know, it's the PGA, or the office of the PGA, the OPGA. You know, there was a great deal of leadership that quickly sort of materialized within this office. And there was a momentum that was sort of put in place through two things with regard to taking advantage of this opportunity. One was to link it with development. To link it with development was important for the UN to do, for the General Assembly to do, because in the past the General Assembly has generally been disregarded as an organ that has any business dealing with economic and financial matters at the global level. So by linking it to development, you create a legitimacy link. It's, you know, it's issue linkage, but you have a stronger platform from which to demand a place at the table if you want to be part of a debate about reform. And the second was to launch the idea was sort of hatched out between senior members of the President of the General Assembly staff to use the Doha meeting that was going on financing for development in late October, early November of 2008 to push this idea forward that there was a window of opportunity and we should seize on it. And what you found was there were all sorts of side room corridor discussions going on at Doha that then led to a provision being inserted into the outcome document there, which crystallized the movement forward to hold a conference 6 months later, 9 months later, that would have some kind of outcome that would change the world. Okay, so everything was sort of, the nugget of this idea was crystallized in the fall of 2008. Linking it to development was thought to be a really good strategic idea, and you know, a normatively good idea as well, because we know that the impact of the crisis, you know, was hurting poor people, and then to launch it out of Doha and financing for development, and that set everything on a path that led toward this meeting that was held at, it was a heads of state level meeting, a summit meeting in June. Now, we can't talk about any of what happened without talking about some of the individuals involved. And at the time, the president of the General Assembly is Father Miguel Discoto Brockman. He will go down in history probably as being one of the more controversial presidents of the General Assembly. This is not a role generally for cowboys, right? This is not, this position within the UN is generally a placeholder position. It's a one-year term. The individuals who occupy this office generally don't make waves, right? They certainly just sort of, sometimes they go with seven. They have their own pet projects, and certainly Father Miguel had his own pet projects, there's no doubt. Some of them get swept aside, and as it turned out, and the more I think about it, his office sunk almost all of their eggs into this basket in dealing with the global financial and economic crisis. It became almost the singular, project for his General Assembly, and I think he really was hoping to have a more positive legacy emerge from the efforts that he and his staff put into this. Father Miguel, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's a Nicaraguan diplomat, former foreign minister, advisor to Daniel Ortega, who also happens to be among the team of Nicaraguans that took the U.S. to the World Court and prosecuted a successful case against them in 1984 or 86. He is a Jesuit, he's a Maryknoll priest, and he is a liberation theologist. He's somebody that believes in revolution. He believes in, fighting the good fight. He is a solidarist. He's somebody that, has lived with the poor. He knows, how they suffer. He's also a moral figure. So it's a really interesting constellation of personal characteristics that, combined with, what was happening at the moment on the international stage, that made him a really interesting figure to handle the response to this crisis for the GA. And that's him in the second picture there. When a colleague of mine, when I was asked to do this, I sort of talked to a few colleagues, and a particular colleague of mine, who Jacques knows very well, I said, do you think I should do this? Because it's a deviation from some of my other research. Should I go and work with them for a little while? And he said, he's a bomb-throwing Nicaraguan. Are you kidding me? You must do this, And who's, again, at the time, nobody kind of knew where this was all going to go. But certainly he's somebody that is an iconic figure. Lot of criticism. He's controversial. A lot of member states, when they mentioned his name, their faces turned beet red. So even in the political world, there are very decided opinions about Father Miguel and his work. But just to briefly, share with you some of his objectives, he had some very noble ideas about how the General Assembly and the UN should respond to this crisis. The first was to ensure that a global stimulus would work for everyone. Many of his goals are in keeping with sort of his personal philosophy on balance, of Mother Earth and the ecosystem, humanity, development, sustainability. So improving global regulation, monitoring, and reform of the global financial architecture was something he thought would be very legitimate and could lead to greater equity in the international economic order. Rejecting protectionism, promoting global trade and investment. These are very standard kinds of ways you might think about reform. And he always had sort of a very humanistic twist, to some of these otherwise sort of clinically economic goals. And then, of course, to contain the impact of the crisis and to protect the poor and the vulnerable, to make sure that they didn't end up worse off after this crisis than they were before. It's a very noble set of goals. And so we start out that way, and through a series of, in some cases, unlucky moments, in other cases, poor planning and mismanagement, the journey from the Doha conference in 2008 to the June summit in 2009, where the GA really intended to lend its voice to the discussions about what to do about the global financial and economic crisis. There were a lot of missed opportunities, a lot went wrong. And it's hard actually to kind of, on the one hand, I'm supposed to be an unbiased scholar. On the other hand, I spent a lot of time working with these people, and I saw how hard they were working. I also saw how many mistakes they made. And it's really hard to write about this without wanting to be softer, without wanting to be, you know, especially he's a priest, you know, like I don't want to be bagging, you know, I don't want to be, you know, dissing Father Miguel. And none of what I say should be interpreted in that way. His office, we'll talk about the reasons why there were a number of missteps, but his office, let's just say, I mean, it didn't function in a way that could have leveraged this opportunity in a more positive direction. What he did do, he set a process in motion, again, beginning in Doha. Intergovernmental negotiations were held starting in late January among member states as to what to do about this conference. And immediately, the political goals of various member groups within the UN system, coalition and bloc groups, became very, very evident. Okay, as you might imagine, northern industrialized countries, particularly the U.S., Japan, JUSCANS, which is a coalition of Japan, the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, had one set of ideas about the conference. And then on the other side, you had the G77 and China. In the middle, you had, even to my surprise, you had countries like Norway and Mexico and Russia that were playing a really interesting role in you know, helping bridge some of the incompatibilities between the positions of JUSCANS and the G77. And even the European Union had some remarkably enlightened thinking about how to use this opportunity to reassert the role of the General Assembly and create a more traction for a permanent place for the UN in these kinds of discussions. Now, the co-facilitators that were appointed were very effective, one from the South, one from the North, that follows a long-standing tradition of creating equity in the process and transparency. The one from the North was from the Netherlands, and the one from the South was from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There was initially another facilitator from Namibia that only played a role for a short period of time. But essentially, there were a couple things, as I said, that were missteps. One had to do with leadership, and some of this couldn't be helped. The structure of the president's office is such that he's given very few resources. His staff are sort of spread out all over the place. You know, it's he sort of has to beg, borrow, and steal to get it. You know, to get the job done, even on a normal calendar year for the General Assembly. Whereas this is a very extraordinary year for the General Assembly, and leadership was something that I think he, on a one-to-one basis, was very good at, but had an office that was largely representative of advisors that he brought with him from Nicaragua. There were some staff seconded from other missions, but it wasn't tapping the diplomatic community in the way that other PGAs have. And this was something he was criticized for later, is that he brought in a bunch of outsiders to work with a process that is really driven by insiders. And it did form problems later on, particularly toward the end of the negotiation process, where you had simply good-intentioned individuals that didn't know how to deal with UN negotiations. The second had to do with the politics of those negotiations. Again, it's painful to write about this, and I know that it's not like the General Assembly is the Security Council. You know, the binding nature of the Security Council many times makes the study of that organ very, very important in politics. I do think that the study of the General Assembly is important, right? This is why, I mean, you know, I spent 6 months of my life doing this, as opposed to doing something else. But I know that there's a different way in which it is important. You know, it does serve as a forum of legitimacy. It's inclusive, 192 nations, each with one vote. It does represent sort of the parliament of man, to use Paul Kennedy's phrase, and it absolutely can sort of take the pulse of, you know, of the world on a particular issue area. And I think it has a great deal of moral authority, which is still important in international politics. But the politics of the intergovernmental negotiations were really quite eye-opening. You know, very strong positions being carved out by the, you know, sort of the usual suspects, the usual coalition groups, and very little willingness to concede and compromise. And what that meant was negotiations took a very long time and they didn't get a lot done. And so we ended up in crisis mode, for example, at the end of the designated period for negotiating over the modalities of the conference, which are really, you know, it's just an agreement about the structure of the conference. And sometimes this is a tactic of negotiation, wear it down until the last minute, and then everyone's got to make concessions, because the last thing anybody wants is to fail and not produce something. And the same held true during the negotiations for the outcome document. Now, the problem with the outcome document, the modalities, okay, fine, people got past it. The U.S. didn't want an outcome document. Most people did. Then the U.S. gave in and said, well, it can be a 2-page outcome document. And then the rest of the world said, no, we want it to be concise, but we're not going to assign a page limit to it. No, we want it to be a 3-day conference. No, a 2-day. They talked about these things for hours and hours. It's akin to sort of watching paint dry on a wall. And, at times I thought, wow, there's nothing happening. Should I leave? But what if something does happen? Should I stay? And then as far as the outcome document itself, well, it was a problem because essentially these positions became very hardened. There seemed to be no real teeth in the draft of the outcome document. And the iterations that the facilitators were trying to massage and allow different groups to get their voices into the outcome document, it wasn't really getting to where Father Miguel thought this document would make an impact. So a decision was taken, and there's a series of events that led to the decision, which I can tell you about later, that led to 8 May. And on the 8th of May was the day when the PGA was going to hold a General Assembly session and release the draft outcome document for everyone. The problem was that he decided he didn't want to use the facilitator's draft. He drafted his own document. And about 24 hours before 8 May, on 7 May, it leaked. And this was a problem. Right? Any time the General Assembly does something, it must, in order to be legitimate, be a member states-led process. And here you had a decision taken by the President of the General Assembly to release his own document. And it rubbed member states the wrong way, as you might imagine. It rubbed the co-facilitators the wrong way. And the Dutch facilitator in particular sort of threatened, to withdraw from the process. So the process was derailed for 10 days as a result of this. And everyone went back to the drawing board, and a new document was produced on the 18th. And then they spent literally the last, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, working day in and day out to hammer this thing out. It went from being about 12 pages to 130, right? And then it went back down to 14 by the end. But that was in the last literally 2 days of the negotiations. And there were times when it was very contentious negotiating. And the problem with Father Miguel's document was that it was very brash. It was very, very caustic in the language that was used. And it suggested a whole range of institutions, new institutions for global economic governance that had, according to member states, no basis in legitimacy. And it really put member states off, not just because he introduced this, but because of the substance of what was being introduced, and that it was supposed to be representative of the G192. Okay, so to fast forward to the conference, which was held at the end of June. It was originally scheduled for the beginning of June, but as you might imagine, they had to push the dates back. The consensus document ends up reading at about 14 pages. It definitely talks about the way the crisis has evolved. It talks about, how to mitigate the crisis. It doesn't necessarily apportion blame, which was something that originally I think, some member states would have liked to have seen more of that in the document. And it does talk about the way forward, which is where I want to spend the balance of my time just discussing where things have gone since then. Because the one real tangible outcome from the outcome document, aside from talking about, what had happened, how the crisis impacted different states and what we need to do to get ourselves out of this, and how the UN has a role and the General Assembly has a role to play in this, was the appointment of the ad hoc open-ended working group, which is now to take this outcome document and turn it into something tangible. And that group has worked now for the past year. They've sort of dissected the outcome document, and they have really spent a concentrated amount of time talking about it over 6 or 7 substantive sessions. And really they've looked at the main cross-cutting issues that the General Assembly feels are the most important ones to deal with in terms of global economic governance: debt sustainability, mobilizing resources to mitigate the crisis, credit and concessionary lending access. And then the last 3 are the ones I really want to just focus on in the balance of my time, because these are the areas where the General Assembly is sort of trying to carve out a role for itself in terms of governance. The other three, the first three, are about mechanisms and retooling those mechanisms to be more effective, but not necessarily to say that the General Assembly should be at the forefront of debate about what to do about those mechanisms, say of debt sustainability, or mobilizing resources. Even, with mobilizing resources, the demand is we need more of them. Not it's about we need more of them. Whereas talking about IFI reforms, it's about we want to be at the table and have a vote. So these last three are the ones that really are about, in my mind, global economic governance. So to continue, we can break them down into, if I go back to those mechanisms, those concepts that are associated with global economic governance, inclusivity and legitimacy were the first two that were listed. And this is an interesting part of what a missed opportunity looks like. And Martin and I were talking about this because, to some degree, in times of crisis, you have some, readiness for change, big change. And as a crisis abates, that urgency, the willingness to cooperate when you otherwise might not want to cooperate, some of that goes away. And where the General Assembly makes claims about what forums should be the legitimate locus for discussions about global economic governance and reform, they have a very solid moral claim in that they are the most universal body in terms of a multilateral body, right, that exists currently in the world. The problem is that that's sort of where they put a full stop. And beyond that, it's hard to know on what other substantive bases we can argue that the General Assembly is a good place, a legitimate place to have these kinds of discussions. So from inclusivity and legitimacy, legitimacy is often also perceived as sort of the reverse side of the coin of effectiveness. But if we talk about the General Assembly and its relationship with other mechanisms that do make these decisions, we can ask if they're the right forum. There are member states that say they have no expertise in this area. Let the General Assembly concern itself with human rights and the perennial issue of Israel and Gaza. Let them do that, right? They don't have any business being in this business. And I think critics were right about that at a certain time, but even the G77 has been smart about consulting widely with not just their own states' finance ministers who do have expertise in this area, but also with NGO and civil society groups like the South Center and others that really are quite smart. And they brought in like Martin Core from the South Center to be their sort of informal advisor during the the outcome, the discussions about the outcome document. So they're certainly doing their homework to become better informed and to have a claim about their expertise. The problem is that attitudes of key member states haven't changed. And so you do have the U.S. usually, again, even in the work that the ad hoc open-ended working group did this year, the one interjection that the U.S. made throughout all of these meetings was to say, the General Assembly has no expertise in these areas and you shouldn't be talking about this. Why are we having this meeting? I'd say they say it much more nicely than that, but that's essentially what they're saying. And so what's happened is you have this, especially with regard to other rulemaking bodies like the G20. There's absolutely no room for entertaining the notion among, the U.S. representatives, for example, that the General Assembly should be there at that table. But in fact, the General Assembly has its own ideas about this, and they've taken. I talk about this as like the Goldilocks approach, where you have some in the General Assembly that say, we can attack the G20 by saying it's illegitimate. Right? It's making decisions on behalf of non-members that have profound impact when those members have no voice at that table. Now, that's fine, but that's not really a position to launch solid reform from. That's just sort of saying, like, we're going to resist because it's our point to resist. We're resistful. And then you have the other side, which says, you know what, let it roll over you. The U.S. has said it's there, and it's going to make decisions on your behalf, whether you like it or not, so just deal with it. And then there's sort of this middle solution, this Goldilocks, just right solution, which has now emerged within the GA, and I do hope that it moves forward, because in fact it's the Global Governance Group, the 3G group. I don't know if you've heard about this. It's led by Singapore, and it now has 28 members, and it's sort of the mantra is to get organized to get heard, especially with regard to the G20 and the relationship between the G20 and the General Assembly. So it's heavy on intellectual content, heavy on substance in terms of its platform and what it wants to do. It essentially was designed in a way to engage the G20 in a more healthy manner and carve out a role for the UN, the General Assembly, and in particular the Secretary General. And it really is sort of laid out 4 proposals that are sort of overlapping. The first is that the G20 must consult with the UN before its summits, and that it must report to them afterwards, which is interesting because you're making demands on an institution that you have no reporting ties to. But there is a moral basis through which the G20 might be amenable to this. The second is to formalize a role for the Secretary General as an observer at G20 meetings. And the Secretary General was invited to the Toronto meeting. He is invited to the meeting next week in South Korea. And I think that there are countries that really support this, a number of countries, the European Union countries. Countries, unfortunately, like I know Pakistan doesn't think this is a good thing, particularly to put so much power in the hands of the SG, where relations between the Secretary General and the General Assembly have not always been that good. Unless the UN has decision-making power, it shouldn't be there. I mean, these are reasons to sort of, poo-poo that proposal. The third is to regularize the inclusion of regional organizations at G20 summits, which is an interesting, way of including General Assembly members, but through another institutional mechanism. And to think about, the value added of including regional groups in those meetings. And the fourth is what they've called a variable geometry arrangement, where the G20 will allow individual nations and invite them to come to the table and be meaningful participants in a dialogue if, in fact, the decisions that are going to be taken or the issues that are discussed have a real impact on those countries. Something like in the Security Council when, members that are party to a conflict get invited to discussions. It's a similar kind of arrangement where you'd have a shift in who's invited every time there's a meeting, but that shift would be meaningful in that countries that don't normally come, that are being affected by decisions, would get invited. So it's a new approach. It's a form of informal leadership that the General Assembly has taken through Singapore, and it's gaining traction. So it's something to watch for. Effectiveness. This is another measure of global economic governance. The problem here that I see, and this has taken me a while to sort of suss out, is that the scope of reform and prioritization is at odds with effectiveness. The scope of reform is we want everything reformed now. This is the most basic way I can say it. We want voice and vote in the IMF, in the World Bank. We want new special drawing rights. We want them to be for development. We want new forms of concessionary lending. There's no prioritization. I don't see any prioritization among these goals. It's and it's also not incrementalism. It's sweeping reform that's being demanded by the General Assembly, even by the ad hoc open-ended working group. And I just don't see how this is going to catch the ear, of important, systematically important countries that have, up until this point, been the drivers of global economic governance. It almost gives those countries an excuse to say the UN doesn't have its act together, so we're not going to listen to it. And then that leads into another problem with effectiveness that the UN has had, which is principles versus pragmatism. Again, the claims that are made about the G192 are based on the fact that they are democratic. This is the one forum in the world where everyone has a vote, every country, and yet they're not putting forward any cost-effective, workable solutions that would lead other member states to say, let's give them a seat at the table, the broader table of global economic governance. And that's, again, a problem. Equity. A call for new and additional resources is a non-starter for the developed world. It just simply is. And it was made clear time and time again in the negotiations leading up to the June conference, and nothing about that has changed. In fact, I think states are even more deeply entrenched in the notion that they don't have resources to give, and that instead what has to be done is we tinker at the margins of the existing arrangements. Unfortunately, that isn't going to bode well for the developing world at all. And it's going to lead to further discord within these forums. Also, the range of policy options for developing nations is something that there's a great deal of there's a logic in allowing states that are suffering from crisis to engage in counter-cyclical measures, right? Don't go to austerity. Don't go to don't employ some Keynes, right? Not Adam Smith. More Keynes, less Adam Smith. And that has fallen on deaf ears in a sense. The IMF hasn't, and they haven't really changed their policies all that much. I think Poland was one of the most recent examples of lending, which again had strong pro-cyclical conditions set into the arrangement between Poland and the IMF. And lastly, voice and vote. There's been some progress on this. There is an equity issue in the international financial institutions that the General Assembly wants to try to correct. They see it as a place where they need more voice, more vote. This is not happening fast enough for them, and it's not happening deeply enough for them. But I don't know that there's a way. I mean, these are Bretton Woods institutions have their own constitutions, and this is something that has been discussed ad nauseum in these debates. That the UN has no rightful authority to change these institutions. They have to change themselves. Sustainability, I mentioned to you that debt frameworks and mechanisms, there's been some new thinking about the way in which these mechanisms can work to make them more sustainable. There seems to be a willingness on the part of financial institutions to do this, much to the happiness of the General Assembly. But this green reform notion, I don't see it entering into the debate, whereas it was very prominent in the debate leading up to the June 2009 conference and the outcome document. It's sort of been lost. Even in this country, we don't hear that much about it anymore. And cash for clunkers, that had no impact on the environment. Okay, lastly, leadership, and this is where I'll leave off. Because the office of the president is absolutely, in my mind, structurally, there have to be some changes made within that office in order for the General Assembly to become more effective, regardless of whether it's on this issue area or any other. Because to have a one-year term, you're you hit the ground running, and before you know it, your term is ended, and you have no incentive to really make change and or to be effective, because you're kind of just in a holding pattern for 1 year until you move on to your next assignment. And likewise, I think, the General Assembly talks a lot about reasserting itself, revitalizing itself, engaging in system-wide coherence. These things, even within the UN, can't be done with the General Assembly president that comes in for 1 year only. Because by the time he leaves, someone else new comes in and has new ideas, undoes the other work. I mean, it's just not sustainable. The role between, or the relationship between the General Assembly and the Secretary General and the Secretariat is also something that has to be mended. This is, at least for now, with Ban Ki-moon and the General Assembly, there's not a lot of productive work going on, cooperation. And that may change as a new SG comes in. But, at least in the case of, I know with Father Miguel, and even to some degree with Ambassador Trekkie, who was his successor in the President's office in the 64th General Assembly, there's a lot of obstruction and resistance between the Secretariat and the PGA, and that has to change. And the last 2 points I'll make are, intra and inter-coalition politics at the UN. There have been some changes over time, but there's a remarkable resilience on the part of the developed world and what they want, and even, on the part of the developing world and what they want. The countries where there's been the most change happen to be European Union countries, and also even I've noticed Russia, Norway, Liechtenstein, Switzerland. These are countries that seem to be more amenable to the developing world views, maybe less so, and even within the European Union, Holland, the Czech Republic, having interviewed many of these reps, they're willing to embrace a new way of doing things at the General Assembly, but member states from the developing world have to sort of prove themselves, and this hasn't happened yet. And so what I'd close with is this notion that, to make claims about legitimacy and having the General Assembly have a place in global economic governance, it can't just be based on the fact that it's an inclusive organization with 192 member states. There has to be some substance behind it. And up until this point, I don't see a whole lot of that being carried forward by this ad hoc, open-ended working group. Now, that may change. And certainly, in the 63rd General Assembly, this issue was given a lot of urgency and attention. In the 64th, which was last year's General Assembly. It was given a little bit less, but still pumping along. It remains to be seen where it's headed in the 65th with Ambassador Deese, and whether or not this issue is an issue for him. Because if it's not an issue for him, it's not an issue for the Fifth Committee. If it's not an issue for the Fifth Committee, this working group doesn't get funded. If they don't get funded, they don't meet. If they don't meet, reform is dead in the water. And the GA's place in global economic governance will revert to what it was before, the crisis began in 2008. So I'd love it to be a little more positive, but, and in some ways, crisis was an opportunity and positive progress was made. But in other very important reform areas, very little progress has been made. So I'll leave it at that and welcome your questions. Thanks.